As promised, I'm joined now by the Shadow Infrastructure Minister, Anthony Albanese. Thanks very much for your company.
Good to be with you, Peter.
Bit of chaos in the Liberal Party, is that the fair way to describe it? They're trying to work out whether Menzies was a moderate or a Conservative. What do you reckon?
It's pretty bizarre that they're debating what happened in the 1940s and 50s when it is a crisis today in the 21st century that they have to deal with right now. So I think these philosophical debates are rather interesting, but that's all they are. I would have thought that they needed to get some practical outcomes rather than academic debate across the other side of the world.
What I find weird about it, I wonder if you think the same on this, is, you know, labelling someone like Robert Menzies Conservative because his views then would be Conservative now is as ridiculous as talking about anyone from that time injected into today. I mean, even radical lefties in the 50s would look Conservative.
It's absurd.
In today's time.
Well, you know, Marx said that he wasn't a Marxist while he was still alive because things change. So a political philosophy of a particular time, if you try and translate it, whether of the left or the right, onto modern times, existing circumstances, then you will run into bother. You end up, I think, largely having an academic debate, but more importantly, getting some quite bad outcomes because you distort what the debate is today. Who knows, the truth is, what Menzies would be like today. He would respond, one would have thought, as someone who was able to change different views over a period of time. He'd do the same thing. And the modern economy is very different. What we do know is that Malcolm Turnbull is certainly no progressive. You can't say that you're progressive if you're not doing something about marriage equality. If you have a report on climate change, the Finkel report, where you come up with the one recommendation that matters, you're not prepared to actually engage with your party room on.
We might get there eventually. It's under consideration. I want to get you on the marriage equality one, though. Poll in the Australian today. Have a plebiscite, 46%. Have politicians decide, only 39%.
Well, that's not surprising. If you ask them, do you want to decide what your tax rate should be, I reckon it'll be a bit higher than 46%. If you ask them, do you think you should decide what education funding should be, I reckon that might hit 80, 90, 95 maybe. That's just a fact of life. I mean, what a rather cute question to ask, knowing what the answer is.
Well,
people will always say, yes, I should decide as a default position. But the truth is that politicians decide the whole range of measures. The other thing is hitting up against reality. There's not going to be a plebiscite. Senate's not about to wake up tomorrow and change. Labor won't change our position. No one...
Even though people want one?
Well, the fact is people want a change. Ask them about health funding. See what answer you get.
Don't get me wrong.
Ask them about media reform and see what answer you get.
Don't get me wrong. I editorialised earlier that the question didn't include that it was a non-binding plebiscite.
Of course, and it doesn't
done that, it's had a different result.
The truth is there will be a parliamentary vote. It's a matter of whether some people saying
a plebiscite that precedes it
that you had that in advance. Well, there is a plebiscite. It's called Newspoll. It's called a range of polls that indicate there's overwhelming public support. I'll say this about marriage equality. There are many people, including parliamentarians, senior people on both sides, who used to oppose marriage equality, who've changed their mind. There's no one I know who used to support marriage equality who says, now I've changed my mind, I think it's a bad idea. History is headed one way here. We're falling behind the rest of the world. In Germany, of course, Angela Merkel just decided, she voted against it, but she decided, let's get on with it, have a vote of the parliament, have a free vote. And it happened, and guess what? The sun still came up in Germany. Life went on. It didn't affect any existing relationships. It'll be the same thing here. People will wonder what the fuss was about. But what it is doing is defining the inertia of Malcolm Turnbull's Prime Ministership. That's why the smarties in the coalition, including some of the Conservatives, want to get this off the agenda, because it's this absolute handbrake on Malcolm Turnbull showing that he's in charge. He never supported a plebiscite. He doesn't now. The only reason why a plebiscite was ever put on the agenda was a blocking move by Tony Abbott. We should call it out for what it is. Get on with the vote.
Yeah, well, I don't disagree with any of that. Let's move into a portfolio discussion. Rare moments of bipartisanship are on display around the country, but there was bipartisanship over at state level in Western Australia between the Labor Premier Mark McGowan and the Liberal opposition leader Mike Nahan, that as a state, their share of GST funding, which is so low, 34 cents in the dollar, means that they can't build the kind of infrastructure that they would like to support another mining boom, that there are all sorts of flow-on negative effects for the national economy. Why won't federal Labor commit to fixing that?
Well, what federal Labor did when we were in government, of course, was to build infrastructure, was to give substantial support, be it the Perth CityLink project, the Gateway WA project.
So on that, can I just ask you, does WA get disproportionately larger sums of infrastructure spending from the Commonwealth, or did it under Labor, than other states? Because it would need that, presumably, to make up for the GST shortfall.
They did when we were in government. We had a separate WA infrastructure fund.
Okay.
And
is that still in?
So projects like, well, we committed at the last election for projects like Perth Metronet, opposed by the coalition government. Now there's some funding flowing through because reality's hit WA. WA needs to get the planning done right for projects and needs to be given support. Across the board, I think there's a case for more infrastructure spending. There was a report last week from the Parliamentary Budget Office that showed that as a proportion of GDP, the size of the economy, the proportion spent on infrastructure over the next decade would fall from 0.4 to 0.2. That is half. That will have a devastating impact on the economy if that is allowed to continue. We know that in the forward estimates, infrastructure spending will fall from a predicted 9.2 was what it was supposed to be this year. In actuality, or in 2016-17, in actuality it ended up being 7.6. But that falls to $4.2 billion in 2020-21.
Is that because they're trying to make the books look better into the future?
They are, which is why you have this rhetoric about not being a postbox for the states and territories in terms of applications.
Can I ask you?
I was in South Australia yesterday. That isn't getting its fair share. I'll be in Melbourne tomorrow. Victoria is getting under 10% of the national infrastructure budget.
Do you think so that federal governments might not be inclined to try to make the forward estimates look better? Do you think that infrastructure should be quarantined from the books? I mean, a little bit like how businesses do their budget.
Oh, absolutely. I think that there is a distinction to be drawn between expenditure on capital investment that produces a return to government and one that basically is a cost, just an expenditure. That's not to say that's not worthwhile.
Sure.
In some areas, like education, it produces a return, but it's much less tangible.
But it's recurrent expenditure, so you need to be able to fund it.
So the difference between recurrent and capital expenditures there, and the government before the budget made some noise about that, but all they've done is to establish this absurd body, the Infrastructure Financing Unit in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, which is looking to fund things that the private sector won't fund. Now, there is not a shortage of capital available in this country for good projects, whether it be from the private sector or whether it be from superannuation funds. Part of my concern with the government's rhetoric is what it means in practice is that they'll just fund toll roads that produce that return. Now, that distorts the market. A rail line mightn't produce an income in terms of through the fare box, if you like, but it produces a return due to opportunity cost when you take into account the improvements of the health system, from reducing emissions, from less car accidents, the reduced amount that has to be spent on road maintenance. There's a range of things that mean that expenditure on public transport is the key to dealing with urban congestion. Malcolm Turnbull said he'd deal with it before he became Prime Minister. He'd overturn Tony Abbott's ideological objection, but he hasn't done it. So I want Malcolm Turnbull to stop taking selfies on trains and trams and buses and start funding trains, trams and buses.
Anthony Albanese, always appreciate you joining us on Newsday. Thanks once again.
Good to be with you.